thank you very much for coming here today and making this day very special for me. And I'm sorry our dean couldn't be here, but I say a big thank you to Professor Rod Thomas, whose idea it was to have this inaugural lecture. He's been egging me on, come on, you can do it. And we had to wait for a pandemic to be over, sort of over, to be able to come up and do this. So my background, let me start. I was born in Mauritius. Some of you will ask me where Mauritius is. And the first difficulty is to find a world map which indicates Mauritius. So that was my biggest trouble, my biggest stress in preparing this lecture. Where is Mauritius? I was born in Mauritius. This is the village where I was born. Crève-cœur, it means the pierced heart. This is the house I was born, my grandmother's house. I attended University of Mauritius as a student and then I did some consultancy after my undergraduate in economics. I know there are two economists in the room, and so the tough questions, I know where they will come from. That's from afterwards. So after my undergraduate, I worked for UNICEF and UNESCO. I did some different work, but I always wanted to come to the UK because I grew up reading Enid Blyton, Mallory Towers, and it was always about, I'm going to go to England and I'm going to have that experience. So it was always in the background, in my mind. I will go to England one day, and that was made possible when University of Nottingham created a special scholarship. Coming from the kind of background I did, I grew up in a country that was quite poor. I couldn't have afforded to go to university unless the University of Mauritius was free, and there was no way going to England. It was always going to be a dream. But University of Nottingham created a special scholarship just for Mauritian students. And one day I got a letter saying, if you're interested to come, we have a scholarship for you. So I went to England at the University of Nottingham, where I did a master's in economics, specializing in international trade, and today I'm very glad I have an ex-student here whom I taught international trade, and now he's doing a PhD at Leeds University, so I couldn't have been that bad. Fully funded scholarship, so I'm not that bad. And then, of course, what I remember of Nottingham is that's where I saw snow for the first time. I happen also have a master's degree from there. I came back to Mauritius, work at the University of Mauritius, which was another big dream come true. Wow, I'm working at the university where I studied. And then the culture started changing. Mauritius is a very teaching-oriented university. It's a fantastic university. The standard of teaching is amazing. This is why we get the scholarship to come to England. But then it started doing research. So after a few years of working, there was that pressure. You need to do a PhD. And then I was program leader at that time, program leader for economics. And our external examiner was Professor Dietrich Fausten from Monash University. So when he came and I worked with him, he was our external examiner, he again offered me a scholarship to Monash University. A one-year scholarship, come to Monash, do a PhD with us. He was very impressed with the quality. So basically in my life, I've just followed the money. And I've gone where the money led me. I went to Monash to do my PhD. I graduated there in 2010 with my PhD. I was part of Team Monash. When you're in Monash, you're part of Team Monash, so you're participating in all the sports. So that's what I remember. We were Team Monash. And then I got a job and started working at Monash University while in my second year of PhD. Year 2, I got a full-time employment, so my PhD became part-time. Now, my PhD was financed by Qantas. The first year is with Monash University, and then for subsequent years, you have to find the funding yourself. And the first year, you do coursework, and at the end of your first year, you do a presentation like this to the whole faculty. All the professors are here and quiz you whether you have a good idea to do a PhD. My idea was sustainability. I wanted to do something on sustainability, on taxation. Well, how are policies, green policies, affecting, what would be the economic impact of green policies in Australia? But when you are funded by an airline company, taxation doesn't sit well. So I was asked, you're a fantastic candidate, we don't want taxes. They wanted what we call elasticity. They wanted to look at what are the effect of income and price on the market. They wanted a market research, which is a consultancy project. And for those of you who have had a PhD funded by industry would know. Industry wants something. To get a PhD, you need to have original contribution. So I had to come up with an idea that would make an original contribution, provide the information to Qantas, but working with the senior economists of Qantas, but at the same time, it had some original contribution that would give me a PhD. So I went back to what I know best, which is trade theory. Earlier today, I was asked who is my favorite economist, and that's Paul Krugman. Two people in the room know what I just said. So I went back to trade theory, which is what I know, and I consider tourism as a flow in services. It's a tourism, it's trade in services. I look at tourism from a point of view, it is export. When we are traveling abroad, we are money that we are spending abroad, that's a form of import. And when people are coming to the UK from abroad, they're spending money into the economy here, it's a form of export. So I conceptualize tourism as a trade in services. And I was interested at that time. There was this paper that came out. Well, I did my PhD 10 years later, but this was a paper that had intrigued me. And it was about trade creation, looking at immigration. Why is immigration creating trade? What is the impact? And immigration is creating trade. They analyzed the effect of more Chinese living in Canada. And these scholars prove that because we have more Chinese in Canada, the trade between Canada and China has gone up. Why? Because as you have, first is the preference. More and more immigrants in your country, they want more and more food, religious items, and clothes. These were the two examples they give from their home country. So it creates some business link. But at the same time, there is more entrepreneurship going on. And when there are trade going on between countries, sometimes there are barriers to trade, which we call the transaction cost. And for example, if I want to set up a business in Japan, I don't know the language of Japan, I don't know the culture, I don't know the system, I don't know the administration. So what do? I employ the Japanese in my business and get him to do that negotiation. And it reduces those costs that I would normally bear. So I took exactly the same, and then their conclusion was there was a very strong impact. Immigration was leading to trade creation, and the impact was greater for import. So Canada was importing more from China as a result of having a wider pool of immigrants in Canada, Chinese immigrants. So I take that and look at what would be the trade in services. How would that affect that same idea? And there had been some work done on the effect of immigration on tourism, and they look mostly at visiting friends and relatives. The idea, the conceptual idea behind it was, if we have more immigrants in a country, obviously we are going to travel more to that country. We are going to travel back and visit our own country. I go back to Mauritius, thus increasing travel between Mauritius and the UK, and my family will come and visit me. So that was about VFR. And the same idea was then expanded by Williams and Hall. And that's quite interesting because I cite Professor William a lot in my research, and this year he invited me to be an external examiner for his PhD students. So that was like, ooh, I've arrived, a tick. And then there's Brian King, who talked about ethnic reunion, having a large population of foreigners in a country. It changed the ethnicity. It makes a country more more diverse, which may lead to more travel. And then Professor Dwyer, who was on my panel for giving me the scholarship, he talked about how if you have more foreigners in a country, it's a form of tacit promotion. You know me, you've just seen what Mauritius looks like in a picture, so somewhere it's forming some ideas. So it will also have this channel. So combining all these channels together, I thought I could develop a model that would look at the effect of immigration on arrivals, but my model would then include, that's the only one, will also include the income and price variables which Qantas wanted. And And this model was one of the most comprehensive model. The literature has looked at the effect of price and income. You have people like Christine Lim, people like Geoffrey Crouch, Nada Kulandran, all based in Australia, who've been working on this kind of models. But it is the first one that included all these variables together and to look at a model. And this paper, well, it was consequently published. So it was a very comprehensive model that looks at quite a few variables. It is a dynamic model. A lot of things when I was preparing this, and I'm thinking one of the contributions of the paper was the emphasis on dynamism. And in fact, I was at the Tourism Economics Conference this year, and the editor for Tourism Economics mentioned, while he was talking about the evolution of tourism demand, he mentioned two authors, and one was me. He's like, how my emphasis on dynamics of tourism demand has changed the direction of the literature. So this has actually made a huge contribution in how tourism demand are modeled now. We look at past travel. So if you have more and more people going to a destination from a country, that would promote even more. So if this year we have 100,000 going to France, next year it will be 100,000 plus something, because they come back, they go on Wikipedia, not Wikipedia, TripAdvisor, there's e-words to mouth, you're talking about your holidays to others. It creates an interest in the destination. So dynamism is important. And then I did the usual price, income and airfare, and I included price of a substitute destination, which is typical demand model. Demand is a function of price, income, price of a substitute, and sometimes and demographics. This is typical what demand theory for the last 200 years, this is what we talk about. But not many models. There were very few who had included price of substitute. And when they did it, it was done as a matter of fact. What is a substitute? I want to travel to Australia. If I don't travel to Australia, what would be the substitute? I'll go to New Zealand instead. And this is how it was modeled. I want to come to England, I can't go to England, I go to Canada. So it was done in a very ad hoc way by the, so I introduced a very rigorous way of deciding what the substitute destination should be that we include in our model. And when I was preparing this, I thought, gosh, this is also common sense, but this is 10 years ago now. This paper is published, it's 10 years ago, and that was cutting edge. And then of course I look at migration, and I chose, I'm still doing the marketing for Qantas. I had the Qantas logo on all my presentation before, and I thought, I'm still grateful for them, so I'm still doing the promotion. And again, I use this method that has been used, the TADAS method of calculating the stock of migrants in a country. And I use that as a way of calculating the stock of migrants in Australia. Now, why Australia? The real reason, of course, is because Qantas is paying for me. You do Australia. But if you look at demographics across the world, Australia in that year, so that I'm talking around 2008, had the second highest proportion of migrants living in the country. 25% of the population of Australia was born overseas, and that doesn't even take into account second-generation migrants. And therefore, looking at immigration, and also at that time, immigration was a very topical issue in Australia. There was lots of debate on what should we do about immigration, should we stop immigration, what happened. The kind of debates we're having in the UK now about immigration was happening in Australia. So this was the model that I developed and estimated, and it's published. And the first contribution that I had for my PhD at that time, so this would have been the model. Yes. So these were the model that I developed, which was, as I say again, the most comprehensive model of tourism demand. I focused the first publication, which was a very, very important publication for me. This was published in 2010 in my second year of PhD. I demonstrated that if you're using panel data set is a data set that has a time and a cross-section dimension. So I'm not looking at 1 year at a number of destinations or looking at one destination over a period of time. I'm combining the two. I'm looking at 91 to 2006, 10 countries. These were published data available from IEBS. And in this case, what I also showed was not only it has to be dynamic, because dynamic gets you better results, but the way we estimate it, and you'll be happy to know I won't go in detail here, has got to take into account the time series property of the data set, because the time dimension, you can see from 1991 to 2006, is longer than the cross-section dimension, which is only 2 countries. So prior to that, we were doing panel data analysis. I'm not the first person to have said it needs to be dynamic. Others have said that too, but then I explain it in a lot more detail. So that was the first publication, single-authored paper published in Journal of Travel Research. Overnight, I was invited to join the faculty. So I was offered a job by Monash University for having published a single-authored paper in a 4-star journal. So in my second year of PhD, I was no longer student, I became a part-time. So it was full-time faculty, part-time student, which was a feat for that time because Monash University tends not to appoint their own students. They want diversity, they want new blood always. So that really gave me a job. So it was very important for me, that paper. It is not just a paper. And then I continued researching this method, and by then I was able to get more data, buy data, beg for data. Beg for data, that's what you learn when you're doing a PhD in economics. Who do I beg for data? And then I was able to extend the data set, and this is the contribution about immigration, which is now a seminal paper. Now there's been lots of papers published now, but again, the main contribution of this one, I can say, is the second paper which used panel data integration. So I was a bit, how do you say, full of myself. I get to cite my own papers in my PhD. Ooh. So a bit full of myself, as you are when you're doing your PhD, because you think like, wow, I'm fantastic. Maybe I was. So I calculated the usual price-income elasticities, which you submit to Qantas Airline. You do your presentation in the headquarters in Sydney, and the chief economist is very happy. But as I say, it doesn't give me a PhD. For my PhD, I need to have new contribution. And the new contribution was the emphasis on the whole process of how immigration is leading to trade creation. But in plain language, it would be how it is leading to more travel between Australia and the home country of the immigrant. And this paper was published in tourism management. By then I was working at Bournemouth University. Through this paper, Professor Stephen Page, who is still the editor of tourism management, offered to be my research mentor, which was great. So I had more input on my work from senior people, and throughout my career, there have been people who have come forward and offered me help, which is great. But this gave me my senior lecturer. So 1 year after joining Bournemouth University as a lecturer, as soon as probation was over, I became a senior lecturer because of this paper, single-authored. So I was no longer the one-paper wonder person. Now I have 2 single-authored in 4-star. I've proved myself, and I've not done that again. Because this paper, from the book chapter, from the thesis chapter, to the publication, has had 15 versions. The version that I thought was good enough to be submitted was version 9. It went through all the revision. Our blessed. Sometimes you wonder who the reviewers were, but it improved the paper and it got published. Version 15 got published. And then I thought, no, I'm not doing that again. So that was, you learn, don't you? You learn. Dynamic person. And so that was a paper which also was very important for me personally, and it still is very important because I'm known as the person. This is one of the papers I've known for, although it's not what I wanted to do. So I've been very pragmatic. And sometimes when I meet people now and I say, why don't you write a paper on this? And they say, oh, that's not what I want to do. And you go, sometimes you have to do what you don't want to do because you get better at it. So that was the second paper I published. And then the third paper was using that same model, but looking at outbound. The first model looked at how is trade, how is immigration leading to more people to come to Australia. And this one looked at how many people, how is immigration leading to people leaving, traveling abroad. During that time, there was an economic boom in Australia. The Australian dollars was really very high, and it was cheaper to travel abroad than it was cheaper I was in Melbourne. It was cheaper for me to go on a holiday in Malaysia than it is to go to a holiday in somewhere in Perth, for example, because Australia was a very expensive destination. So outbound tourism was really rising, and I wanted to see how immigration leads to that. Now, I couldn't say now this is the third paper which used panel data co-integration, can I? It doesn't work the third time. So it had to come up with something new. And 3 months before my graduation, my submission, my supervisor remembered I exist and asked me, so what have you been working on? And I said, I can't work on this. The third paper is just not working because I can't get a price elasticity. How can I have a demand model which keeps saying that price, which is measured by exchange rate, what is the exchange rate between two countries? And when people take the decision, we can say the exchange rate helps them decide how expensive or cheap a destination would be. And it was, all the analysis I did kept showing that it's not working. In my model, the price was never significant. And that's wrong. That's a problem. Because demand, you're talking price, you're talking income. And if price doesn't work, you have a problem. But by then I was happy, like, you know what, I can't. You reach that point. And that's when you know you're ready to submit, because, and I say that to the PhD students in the room today, the day you're fed up, as long as you tell me I'm enjoying my PhD, I'm like, oh, we're in trouble. The day you tell me you're fed up, I'm like, oh, we're gonna have a submission soon. So, are you doing a PhD? Am I right? So as long as you're enjoying it, trouble. So basically, I was happy. So with the help of Professor Forsyth, we developed an index that we could use instead of real exchange rate. And we explain in that paper why real exchange rate is not going to work into a model of outbound tourism. And this paper was then eventually published with, I had said no more single authored. And this is a paper where my supervisor and I, we worked together on. It was a chapter, so it was published with them in Annals, my first publication in Annals. So that would have been the contribution. And then when I became the professor and people come and talk to me, I realized there's that perception, wow, she's published in this top journal, she's so good. And what sometimes our younger colleagues do not understand is this is the tip of the iceberg. What you see here is the success. You're not looking at how many times the paper was rejected. And my colleagues sometimes are surprised, like, you get papers rejected? Yes, for every one published, 4 are rejected. That's a standard ratio, I would say. Or a paper gets rejected 4 times before it's accepted somewhere. So this is the bit that I was not able to do. And I wanted to also have a third contribution on airfare. How does airfare affect demand? And to be able to know that, you have to know how airfare is determined in the first place. And one of the things that airline economics will tell you is to start a fight in any airline, the easiest thing to do is to just ask the person next to you, how much did they pay? And you will realize that in a plane, there's so many airfares for the same destination on the same seat. And because of that, my data is an average data. It's full of measurement errors. So what the literature has done, they instead say, don't use airfare data. Airfare is related to the price of oil. So let's look at the oil prices in the world. That gives you an indication of what airfare would be. And then I explain why that might not be the right proxy to use, especially if you're looking at a cross-section. If I'm doing a cross-section analysis, every airline company, not every, most airline company would have more or less pay the same price for their oil, for their gas, for their energy. Some in the Middle East would pay different prices. So it doesn't really work in a cross-section. And others have used distance. Now these are proxies, so they are okay, but they are not perfect. And so distance doesn't work, because if I'm looking at arrivals between Australia and the UK over a period of time, the distance doesn't change. So using distance doesn't work in a time series. So using oil and distance in a panel data which has both time series and cross-section is not going to help. And it has measurement errors because my data is not good. And using that to estimate creates problems. And it challenges the validity of the effect or the relationship that I have calculated. So this was a problem that I was not able to solve in my PhD. So I didn't do everything for my PhD. So I got it published anyway. And I got it published, and this is the only funny, sexy, or whatever you'd call it. And it's called Computing Airline Elasticities or Opening the Pandora's Box. So basically, if you're trying to open that, you're trying to calculate that, it's rigged. So this was then published. This was published again while I was a student, and something that I was not able to do, and I still don't know what to do with, and I don't want to do it because I was never really interested in immigration. But it has opened many doors, this, because I'm not saying I'm the one who started looking at a trend on immigration. There was always some research. It was always mostly qualitative. But having done this paper, it opened up an avenue for research. We had more and more research done on what's happening in Europe then, what's happening in Italy. And this gave me a visiting professorship. So by the time I was a senior lecturer, I was invited to be a visiting professor at University of Cagliari. And I still have a very strong relationship. And since we have developed that relationship and we've published together. So as I've done my research, I've published, my network has expanded. I've met fantastic people. We have someone from Cagliari in this. So if you go by what people from Cagliari are like, you know they're absolutely fantastic. But it just kept evolving, and it increases your network. Wider network always mean new ideas. And this immigration, then we went further to look at different markets, not for my PhD, but we got some research fund. I did, and my supervisors got some research fund from Government of Australia and Monash University, and we expanded that research further to look at how are the different categories of travelers, leisure travelers, business travelers, visiting friends of relatives are affected. So having done that, my PhD, what I was known for, you become a senior lecturer, you become a principal lecturer, and then you realize, I'm free now. I can work on what I've always wanted to work. And that was taxation. I've done it. And that was like doing a second PhD. And I did this very first, and I looked at the air passenger duty, which is a tax that's imposed on travelers. And around the time when I was doing that research, not 1994, it was set up in 1994, and I think I started this research around when I came to the UK. I knew nothing about the tourism industry of the UK. I was specialized in Australia, so it was a way for me to get to know what's happening in the UK. And you can see how the revenue from this tax keeps rising. And at the same time, the outbound travel from the UK keep rising. And that immediately says something to me, that tax is not preventing people from traveling. The tax is just raising revenue. So you couldn't argue it was a green tax. It was never really argued. When it was introduced in 1994, there was some kind of commission debate in the parliament, sort of hinted it might be a green tax to reduce carbon and so on, but never, it was never very explicit. So this was imposed. And during this time, we had this huge surge, and this is the revenue. It kept rising. It is one of the most lucrative source of revenue for the government now. And this tax was introduced in 1994, very simple tax, £5 for everyone. 2009, it was £5 for the UK and EU, and £10 elsewhere on domestic and international flight. Then it was reformed in 2001. Major reform was domestic, you don't pay taxes, so you're encouraging air travel within the UK, so it can not be a green tax, definitely. And then it changed, the different structure changed. And our research was to look at how is the tax impacting. So by looking at the graph already, you know it's not impacting. And the problem when you're a tourism economist is whenever you're going on holiday, you don't switch off, because as soon as you're sitting in the plane, you're like, I paid this much, I wonder why, what was the tax? And that's 12 hours. So by the time you reach Mauritius, you get an idea for a paper, you write it during your holiday and you come back. And so this has really bothered me a lot. And gosh, that's huge. So I did this analysis. Of course, any demand model will have income and price. And what okay, so the tax column shows you the effect, and the effect you can see how much it is discouraging travel, and it's a negative because a tax will always have a negative effect. But you can see that it's always less than 1. It is an inelastic effect, which means that if you impose the tax, you're going to increase your revenue, and if you increase the tax, you're going to increase the revenue because demand is not going to fall by much. If it was greater than 1, then the only way you increase your revenue from the tax is to reduce the tax. So this was not surprising, but annoying, because it just like, come on, something, that's not economic theory. And if you've done as much economics as I have, it's like it bugs you, you can't sleep, you want what's happening next. So I was able to secure some funding and ask the question why. And at that time, Richie was my undergraduate student, very smart, and I had this lecture in class, and then, so he decided he was going to go and find out why. And he went to Bristol Airport and not interviewed, he had a questionnaire and he talked to around 281, that was his sample size. 200, that was an undergraduate dissertation. And so he came up with different reasons why. So flights are so cheap, so people may not be so interested in a higher tax, it may not affect them. And it could be you're having, there are other effects. But the most important was people didn't know that they're paying a tax, because when they're buying a ticket, if I ask you, where did you travel last time? By plane. And if I ask you, how much tax did you pay? You're like, I paid a tax, I didn't know that. So people don't look at the taxes. So that was the outcome of his dissertation, the finding from his undergraduate dissertation. And but one thing that did come out in that dissertation that was interesting was people do not pay attention to the amount of tax that they charge, but they look at the free airfare and they are aware that there are some charges that's increasing the actual airfare. So when they are traveling, instead of going to too short a destination, 25% in his sample said, we'd rather go long haul for a longer duration. So there was some duration effect here. I'm paying more tax, so I'm not going to a destination. I'm not going to Mauritius twice. I'll go to Mauritius once, but I stay longer. So there was some behavioral change, but we didn't know more. And then I got some funding, carried out a survey of British travelers. We got a sample size of 2002 respondent about tax, which is great. This was a sample which was representative of the population. It was not purely random, it was stratified. It was stratified by the income distribution of the country. So the sample exactly represented the income and education distribution of the UK to make it representative. So we asked people, are you willing to pay for taxes? Because obviously people seem not to mind. And we saw that, what is quite interesting, we divided it into 3 categories of travels, short haul, medium haul, and long haul, and look at economy class and business class. And what is interesting is for short haul, we have business travelers, 78% said, yeah, we're willing to pay a tax. Coming from Mauritius, that's a shock. But that's British. And medium haul, you're like almost same, 79% of economy or business class are happy to pay it. Not happy, but they're willing to pay a tax. They think we should pay a tax. And when you look at long haul travel, it's slightly more. But for short haul, you can see business travelers are more willing to pay the tax. Now, this questionnaire was designed by my friend Marta Dizenia, who is a fantastic statistician. I never collect data without having a statistician design the questionnaire, because then that's the only way you make sure you're getting fantastic data to get fantastic analysis published in top journals. And it's always about publishing in top journals, isn't it? So we got our first set of results in 2018, and obviously there was a willingness to pay for the tax, and that willingness in all three cases for short haul travel by economy class, they were willing to pay £16 of tax, and the actual tax that they would have paid was lower, was 14. So it was the only one where the willingness to pay was higher than what the government was actually charging. And for all the other taxes, for business travel, or for medium short haul and long haul travel, the willingness for people to pay for that tax is lower than what they're being charged. So somehow a person then who's paying the tax feels they are paying more than what they should. And when they were asked why, 78% of my sample wants to pay tax, why? And the main reason is we need to pay a tax because this tax should be used to fund environmental projects, airport developments, and then some others. So from the beginning there's that feeling that I'm paying a tax and this will be used to pay for carbon emission and use for project that would make my travel carbon neutral. And that's why they want to pay the tax. But then again, I kept thinking, if you're having to pay more tax, then what is happening? Where is that money come from? So if I'm going to Australia, I'm going to pay £90 more for one person. But if I'm a family of 4, that's £90 times 4. That was the British Airways, and we amongst us we call that the sleeping of the enemy happening amongst the airline companies. So all these rival airlines, Virgin, British Airways, who normally don't talk to one another, came together to lobby against the air passenger duty and to reform that tax, because any company wouldn't want more taxes. And so my question then was, where is that money coming from? Where is that money coming from? Where is it coming in my budget? So then we used the same data. We looked at the decision that people take, the decision. And whenever we're traveling, we're deciding on a budget. According to the literature, it's a different step. There are 3 steps involved. There are 2 steps involved, and our contribution was to look at it as 3 steps. So first step was, what is my budget going to be? What is my holiday budget? How much do I want to spend? My second step, which is what we added, was how much of that money am I going to spend in the UK? And how much will I spend abroad? So that was a very strong contribution in the sense that we've always looked at outbound travel as an import. And from the time I did my PhD and I talked to people and I listen, when I say talk to people, it's everybody. I talk to everybody and just say, well, what do you think about that? Especially people who are not economists, people who are not tourism experts. Just on the bus, you start a conversation. Or if somebody starts a conversation with me, it will come to taxes. So I can scare people too. And it was important. And again, it came to me like, it sounds so common sense to me that part of our budget is spent in the destination, but it hadn't been done before. So that was an important contribution to show that origin expenditure. So you decide, what is my budget? How much will I spend at the origin? How much is at the destination? And at the destination, what are the different categories of expenditure? You have your basic expenditure, which is going to be food and accommodation. And then you have your discretionary expenditure. It would be your going to the museum, your cultural expenditure, your expenditure on entertainment, on shopping, not your basic food and accommodation. And this is how we model. And what we found out here, somebody will have to keep time. And what we did find out here is people who were aware of taxes that are paid, people who were aware of people who were aware of taxes that's being paid, they already factor it into the expenditure. Oh, I know I'm going to pay, so it's not like I'm going to Australia. It will include airfare, so the budget includes that already. But people who were not aware that they have to pay a tax, and that tax increases, so they've not budgeted for that possibility, would see at the second level, they would see their transport, it doesn't work, no. Okay, they see their transport expenditure go up. And because the transport expenditure will go up, so okay, on average, you will have £3,000 to go on a holiday to Australia. If suddenly you have per person, you have to pay £90 more, which means your transportation, what you allocate to your transport goes up by £90. Where does that £90 come from? What are you going to cut down? Either you already factor in, you will increase your budget, or if you have not factored in, you're going to cut down on your other expenditure. And what we found out is they end up cutting up on expenditure at the destination. They're cutting down on how much they spend on accommodation. They're cutting down on, so maybe if I have to pay more on tax, I will stay on a cheaper accommodation. It doesn't affect the duration of stay. And this, although we were just looking at budget allocation, it brought a lot of results about demographic. It gave us the opportunity to look at what's happening to age. How are the younger people behaving? How are the older people behaving? Younger people would tend, it's not the key finding, so it's a bit smaller there. It's for you to listen and not to read. So the older people are cutting down on discretionary expenditure, so maybe they're doing less shopping, less entertainment, whereas the younger people are cutting down on accommodation and food, so they're eating, that money is coming from their basic expenditures. And female tourists, male tend to spend more, and that gave us a lot of additional, and a lot we look at the effect of education, age, gender, a lot of additional findings that were not necessarily related because we wanted the effect of tax. So then we took that and we expanded it, and we did a research just on the demographics effect, and that was a research that is published in ANAS with my colleagues in Cagliari. So we published 2 papers just looking at the demographics, expenditure in the UK and demographics. That's not my area of research, but if you have the data, and that was a research fund for £9,002, you want to get it published and you want to show it was good value of money to fund my research. So this is how it extended. And I had enough because it was like doing a second PhD. It was a huge amount. For my PhD, I used secondary data. So for the second one, well, it's not my second PhD, but it felt that way because I really looked into detail. It was collecting primary data. I was helped by Professor Haiyan Song and his student from Hong Kong PolyU to do some of the analysis. And, and I still have a lot of questions, which I was not going to continue to look at. It's like, I've done enough with, so what do you do? Undergraduate student, who wants to do this? I really want to know, but I can't be bothered. Can you do it for me? And it works, and it works. So I had Eva who did her undergraduate dissertation looking at taxes. She had a hypothetical situation. She created a scenario. She asked, if taxes was to go up, what will you do? And then she looked at, if taxes was to go down, what would you do? And there's an asymmetry to respond. If we increase tax, demand will fall. But if we reduce tax, demand will increase, but by a lot more. So reducing tax will boost travel a lot more. That increased tax will reduce travel. And this one is published in Journal of Air Transport Studies with Eva. And but I think it could go further. So then I also, because I got a funding and it got this publication, I got more funding. I recruited a PhD student. I'm like, why don't you do something on taxation? Devise a PhD project on taxation, and he's done some more work looking at implication for small island development state, because there is a distributional effect here. If British government, if the UK is increasing tax, and that means I'm spending less at the destination. So these destinations who are less developed and depend on the revenue are going to have the impact from their tourism industry reduced. So this research can be taken further, but not me. Not me. I'm done. Then I came to what really passionates me. I've always been interested in my research, but then I get over them and I move on. So then it was about poverty. Because when you're reading, because the thing is, when I was a program leader, we introduced new subjects, and one of the subjects that we introduced was tourism economics. And tourism economics was not taught. It was a very new subject when I introduced it in the University of Mauritius around 2004, 2005. So I had to prepare everything from scratch. What should the subject include? There are not much reading. So having done that preparation for the course, I got a lot of ideas. Oh my goodness, there's no paper on this, there's not much said on that, I don't understand this. And my students would just shoot questions. I'm like, I don't know, nobody's done it, I have no clue, but we think we can postulate this is what should happen, but we don't know. So this then, that is why it's so diverse what I do. It comes from that teaching. I know we encourage to do research-based teaching, and for me, all my research has been inspired for my teaching. And my student, who is my ex-student here, will confirm that. So we looked at poverty, and this is something that really interests me. It is vaguely linked to the work on taxation, because you're looking at impact of tourism. I've always wanted to do something on impact, and I understand the methodology, but I myself cannot develop the methodology for that. I could, it would take hours. Not hours, months. It would take months, so why not work with someone who's already developed that methodology? So we looked at the different channels through which tourism affects poverty. Now again, I'm coming from it from a very economic perspective. And looking at the literature, well, there's not much literature which explain that in detail, but there are 4 channels, and it can have a positive or a negative effect. There's much, the literature on tourism and poverty is very, very, very rich, but it's qualitative literature, and it's super fantastic and inspiring. So reading that, putting in the economic lens, which is what I do, we developed this model here. So income channel, you're developing your tourism industry. If you have the poor people, poor household within your supply chain, obviously it will reduce poverty. You have the tax channel, the tax that is, for example, we obtain the air passenger duty. There are other tax that are tourist tax that you get. There are taxes that you're getting from companies, from people working, they're paying income tax, corporate tax, specific tourist tax. Government gets a revenue from the industry. And if that revenue is used for poverty reduction programs, so it is going to affect. And then you have the price channel, which can be positive or negative. Now the literature tells you it can have a positive effect. You can reduce prices of certain commodities within your destination, especially if it's important, if your currency is appreciated. It will reduce the price of certain commodities which the poor people are consume, and then it is going to have a positive effect, because whatever bundle of goods they consume is now cheaper. But it also can have negative effect. For example, in Thailand, as a result of tourism development, price of rice has gone up. And that is a staple for the poor. So the poor people in Thailand are worse off Whereas in Brazil, work done by Professor Blake is the prices of champagne and caviar and is a different bundle of goods has gone up tremendously because of tourism. And those are not the goods consumed by the tourist. In fact, consumed by the tourist, but not by poor household. So it has a positive impact because the prices of the goods that the poor consume has gone down. And then it changes the economy. It changes the economy, it changes the structure of the economy, it creates a new economic environment, and that can have a positive or a negative impact depending on how inclusive your development is. So in this research, the contribution was, I hope you're able to see that, every research that we have looked at, the quantitative research, has looked at what is the poverty head count. What is the poverty head count? And how is tourism development reducing the poverty head count? And if we had a poverty line, I'm not going to debate whether we should have a poverty line or not. So if you have a poverty line, anybody below that poverty line is a poor person. And in both cases, we have 24. So if 1x is 1,000, so we have 24,000 poor here, and we have 24,000 poor here. And the research, because they're using poverty head count to measure poverty, they are only looking at how many people are crossing the line. And the effect is very small because the people who are closer, as tourism is developing, through the 4 channels that I have mentioned before, you have people who are able to cross the line, the one which are closer here. So if the poverty line is $1 a day, maybe they're earning 80 cents, they're earning 60 cents for tea, 20. That's how I teach in class. I'm sorry if I sound a bit patronizing. But, so if I look at poverty line, I'm only looking at how many people are crossing the line. And what the research has shown is that the net effect, the number of people who are crossing the poverty line, is very small. And we thought we'd go into more detail and look at why is it so small? It's always a thing. Why? So why is it so small? Why is tourism not reducing poverty? I have seen in my country it has reduced poverty. I've seen other places where it has not. So what we have seen happens, we use the case of Kenya, is that tourism development is creating poverty in some sectors. So if I go back to my line here, there are people who were not poor before the tourist industry takes off. But they become poor, they become blanc, how French, they become here. So they cross the line in the wrong direction because there is a migration that takes place. From the rural sector, people are moving to the urban sector in Kenya. They're moving from the villages to the cities, so we're not left with people to work in the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector is contracting, making the people in agriculture, some are losing the job and others are getting poorer. So you have a negative impact on agriculture, but people who are able to be in the urban sector, where the tourist developments take place, where all the job created have been created, they're moving across the line in the right direction. So they cancel out. The net effect is very small. But then, of course, there's more happening. There are different ways of measuring poverty in the tourism literature and in the economics literature. Another way of measuring poverty is the distance from the poverty line. So instead of just counting the number of people, I count the distance here. What is the gap of this person from the poverty line? And I calculate the whole distance. And then when I compare the two situations, this is a destination where we have fewer, where poverty is less serious. This is poverty gap. This is poverty intensity. So we would say poverty is less intense here because although those people are below the gap, they are closer. They're below the line, they're closer to the line as compared to the distribution here. So using that measurement of poverty, we were able to show, so tourism is not reducing the head count, but it's helping people come closer. It is reducing the distance from the poverty line. So they're not crossing the line, but they were earning 60 cents before. Now maybe they're earning 80 cents a day. They're slightly better off. And then when we look at poverty severity is again looking at the distance, but adding more weight to the further away, looking at how many people are very far, giving more weight to the people who are further away from the gap, then that also. Tourism has the effect of moving the very severely poor people. Severely poor people can even mean negative income. Not only you don't earn an income, but you owe. So, and they are able to move out. So tourism was not reducing poverty, but it was making it a bit less intense. There were some effects, as we found out in. And this is one of the papers I'm most proud of because, anyway, so this would have been some of the key findings. So that would be my key findings. Yes, exactly. So this would be some of the key findings of the papers that has defined my career, that is talked about. The papers that people will ask me, can you give a guest lecture on this? Invite me for a talk and seminar, can you give a keynote? So these would be the three areas: immigration, taxation, and poverty. The three areas where I am known for. But some of my work has had some non-academic impact. We know about impact, or you're going to know about impact soon. And so I work at Bournemouth University, and some of the work that I did was submitted in the previous ref as a impact case study, some things that I'm very proud of. And one of these was the consultancy project that we did for Airport Commission on the discussion of why, if we want to increase capacity of airports in the UK, why having a fourth runway in Heathrow is going to reach higher economic impact for the country. And that was a very important piece of research that led to major policy decision by the government. So this would be some of the research that I have done and the impact. And all this work that I do has always inspired. So I'm inspired by my teaching. And over the years, I've developed this course. On an economics program, I've taught everything, all level, everything. But once I started doing research, I couldn't go back to being only teaching. So since I've started doing research, these are the courses that I've developed. You start by economics for tourism, not really knowing what you're doing, and you're like advanced economics for tourism professional, it sells better. And so basically, I've used my research based on which I've developed. And for Leeds Beckett now, I want to develop a course called Tourism Development and Policy. It won't be technical, but it would be looking at tourism through the lens of economics for our students. I think it's very important that our students are aware of that. So it has always, and I've always been inspired by my students. And over the years, so I've received a few awards, and I'll say thank you, So with my students, and being a professor, maybe it's a bit of what I miss, that closeness with students. I've always been very close to them, and they've liked me. And the weirdest review I've ever got for my class was, it's good value for money. And that was never the intention. But they come in my class the first day, they go home, and it's like, no way I can do this. And at the end of the year, they're explaining to me, oh, but that elasticity, Nilu, the Bank of England said this. And you're like, why do you know what the Bank of England said? It's like, oh, but you said this in class. And then at graduation, you meet the nans who say, oh, so you are Nilu. So you're known at home because you're the one who created the stress. But over the years, they realize what they've learned, and they call that value for money. And I keep these because this is what inspires me. If I want to do my research, where will it get published? Will it have an impact? How do I get teaching out of it? So that defines who I am as an academic. They're all three aspects. Not so much impact, but maybe impact will have to become more important now. And for all of this, I can always only thank my parents, my mom and dad, picture taken on my dad's 70th birthday. And I grew up in a time when Mauritius was very distinguished. Guys do this, girls end schools and go into find a job and get married. And well, my father had only 2 daughters, so it's not so, but he is very avant-garde. So he brought me up. Your woman doesn't, your girl, your woman doesn't mean that should hold you back. If you've got the brains for it and you're willing to work hard, you go for it. The fact that your woman shouldn't hold you back. And he has had that same influence on people he has worked. And I'm the first woman in my family to have gone to university. And my mother finished school at the age of 11. My dad left school at the age of 16, which was normal at that time, because when you come from that kind of poor background, you have to contribute to the family. But they wanted their children to have a different life. So I was the first to go to university. And my personal contribution that I'm very proud of is, after me, all my younger cousins, younger girls in my family, everyone younger than me in my family has been to university, with master's degrees at least. So that would be my personal contribution. Thank you very much. Thank you.